The strength of family and friendship is wonderful. In fact, in many ways, I have more close friends here in Ukraine than I have back in England, almost.
Welcome to Storytelling Ukraine. Fun stories of peace, sad stories of war, true stories of life in Ukraine. And today I don't have to make any introductions. It just suffices to say that today we have with us Dr. Henry Marsh. Thank you so much for finding the time.
No worries.
And you've been coming to Ukraine for over 30 years now.
32 years, yes.
32 years exactly. What is your first memory of Ukraine?
Everything had ground to a halt.
Okay.
Everything had stopped. It was in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it felt like a country in complete limbo, in complete stasis.
I see.
It felt bleak, derelict, come to a full stop.
And then, as you were coming here more and more often, things started to change.
Well, I felt right from the start that Ukraine was a young country with tremendous potential, but struggling to escape a very, very difficult past. And the war now is a reflection of that continuing conflict between freedom and autocracy.
And if to think back about these 32 years, what has been the greatest or the most significant change that you've noticed?
Young people speaking English,
Okay.
I think. When I started working, only a few people spoke somewhat broken English. But now there's much more. And there's a whole new class of educated, dynamic young people who look towards Europe.
I see. So that's speaking on the societal level.
Yes.
But if we just talk about the streets, the way that people dress, the way that people behave.
Well, it looks more and more like any other European country.
Right.
And obviously the first thing that changed, everybody rushed out and bought Western cars, and then advertisements appeared.
Right.
And then shops started appearing, but it was cars first.
Cars first, yes. The symbol of status.
Yes, yeah.
And Western.
Yes.
Western
And of course the infrastructure doesn't support all those cars, so the traffic problems in the big cities are terrible.
Yeah, true. Very much so. So speaking about problems and difficult things, is there anything that you basically never got used to in Ukraine? Something that you still struggle with? Something that is really hard to accept?
It's a difficult question to answer that. I get frustrated by the sort of inefficiency of things. The way, on the one hand, Ukrainians are wonderful at organizing things at the last moment, and everything more or less falls into place. But it's always at the last moment.
Right.
And there's a certain sort of lack of discipline almost in getting things done. Obviously my main involvement is medical, and it's only in a very narrow area of medicine, because neurosurgery, although it has a high profile in terms as a percentage of medical activity, it's very small, because fortunately neurosurgical problems are relatively rare. And there's obviously been an enormous progress, particularly in equipment. And superficially things seem to be getting better. And then every time I come, I will see one or two most appalling mistakes, which just stagger me. And it's not that these are necessarily bad doctors, but they're just not educated properly. The medical education is chaotic and almost, in a sense, almost non-existent. There's no proper organized training of doctors in the way there is in the West. And that clearly needs to change.
So I assume there hasn't been much progress then?
Very little progress. I mean, I know people are trying to change it.
Right.
And Juliana Suprun, whom I was a big fan of, was trying to change things. as Minister of Health under Poroshenko a few years ago. But most of the old structures continue, a very hierarchical system, which still largely depends on bribery, both patients having to pay doctors because doctors are paid so little by the state, which is, so you could call them informal co-payments rather than corruption. But the educational system runs on that too, and you can buy your medical diploma. And a country in which something as important as medical training can be bought without people being properly trained, I think is a very serious indictment of that society.
Do you think that maybe part of the problem is because the academia as such is a pretty conservative?
It's very conservative, and it also is still the old Soviet system, and much of that was a sort of Potemkin village. They had all these hospitals, big hospitals, and academic professorships and cathedrals and all that stuff, but the cupboard was empty. There were lots and lots of cupboards, but Soviet medicine, the cupboards are empty, except for the people at the top of the nomenclatura. So there was a lot of talk and theory, and people would write books, but it actually practically, Soviet medicine had deviated away from orthodox mainstream Western medicine from sort of 1917 onwards, and it's struggling to get back again, and it's very patchy.
So it has to reinvent itself, basically.
Well, it has to look at the West and decide what system do we want to follow. And I know Uliana was trying to, in many ways, follow the English NHS system, which is by no means perfect. And I know Ukrainians in England are terribly critical of the health system because they say it's so hard to actually see a doctor, and then there are endless long waiting lists. Whereas here, you can get an opinion instantly, and you can get an MRI scan instantly. But whether you then get actually the best treatment or not is another question. It's rather the other way around in England. It's bloody difficult to get into the system, but then on the whole, you'll get good treatment once you've arrived.
Right, yeah. So speaking about England, we mentioned the NHS and the Ukrainians who now live in England and in the UK in general. So have you noticed any change of the perception of Ukraine over these years? And I'm not talking about the war, because obviously now Ukraine is in the headlines, but how has this perception of Ukraine...
Well, enormously, because I used to come back to England in the 1990s and say I'd been to Ukraine. People would either say, oh, that's Russia, isn't it? Or they wouldn't even know where it was. I was total ignorance, is the answer. And now obviously that has changed quite profoundly. England, or Britain, remains strongly supportive of Ukraine. The issue is not political in any way. All the political parties are completely firm about continuing to support Ukraine. But clearly people have a fairly superficial understanding of the country from the media.
Right. So do you think that the Ukrainians who came to the UK since the start of the full-scale invasion, do you think that they've made some contribution into changing this state of things, into educating or maybe telling more about the country?
I don't know, to be honest. Certainly everybody's aware of Ukrainian problems, and there is this strong tradition in English history, despite the empire and colonialism, of sympathy for underdogs.
Right.
And there's always been a strong charitable element to English culture. It's all riven with lots of contradictions. You know, it was a racist, imperialist, slave-owning power for hundreds of years, which people tend to kind of forget. But there is deep sympathy for Ukrainians. Obviously, people don't quite they think it's well, in one sense, it is a straightforward story of an autocracy invading a democracy. Right. But the fact there's so many internal conflicts within Ukraine, and the fact that eastern Ukraine was largely Russophile, Russia-leaning, it gets rather complicated explaining that to people. And of course, you can't really understand Ukraine's problems without understanding some of the history, which is diabolically complicated.
It is. It is. Well, just like the history of the United Kingdom itself.
Yes, but the difficult bits were hundreds of years ago, when you had all the various kingdoms and Angles and Saxons and Norsemen and Danegelt and all that. But for the last 200 or 300 years, Britain has been a fairly stable entity.
Right. Right. Yeah, which makes it very different from Ukraine, which has been unstable for most of its
and also the fact
history.
it was, certainly in the Second World War, it was between a rock and a hard place, between Nazism and between German fascism and Russian fascism.
Exactly.
And although I do feel that in some ways, I feel very uncomfortable the way Stefan Bandera and what was the other guy called, Rufchevsky, the other sort of OUN leader who was assassinated by the MVD.
Konovalets?
No, somebody. Anyway, everybody's got dirty hands. Britain has dirty hands, but it is. We just on the way here from Kiev, we drove past the SS Galicia cemetery, and my Ukrainian friends get very defensive if I ever raise this. I accept that the Azov battalion is no longer a sort of hard right-wing fascist organization. But it is difficult, and the Russians have made very effective propaganda from all this. Sure, it's totally hypocritical.
Absolutely.
But, so, it's not, during a war, it's not maybe a good time to discuss it, but what went in Volhynia and Galicia in the middle of the last century was pretty awful.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so every country has like very dark pages.
Yes, and as Snyder's book, Bloodlands, the history of Ukraine is written in blood. And of course it's very difficult for people in comfortable Western democracies to really understand that, and also to understand the culture which, more or less until recently, the state was essentially your enemy. In England, we complain about politicians and bureaucracy, but the essential position is that the state is there to help us.
Right.
But here, when it hasn't entirely changed, the state is out to get you.
Exactly.
And that's difficult.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the things that, the Ukrainians are fighting for.
Yes, exactly. A civil society, of course.
Of course, yes. Yeah. The civil society.
But that has to start at the bottom as well,
Right.
You can't just expect it all to be... And sure, you can't expect to get rid of corruption and dishonesty if people at the top are corrupt and dishonest. But even then at the bottom, I think your medical students, well, they shouldn't really pay the teachers to pass their exam. They should work hard and pass the exam.
Exactly. Okay. What do you think about the approach that some students take of going to the West and taking and doing their degrees in Western universities and then coming back to Ukraine?
Well, my worry about that is they won't come back. It's a huge problem, medical migration, because of the language problem. I was just saying at a discussion I was taking part in at the Pinchuk Foundation yesterday, but in many ways, because English is the lingua franca of modern medicine, really, medicine should be taught in medical schools in English. But then I'm sure you'd find a large number of the medical students, when they qualified, would go abroad.
Exactly.
I work quite a lot in Albania, a country I know very well, and a huge proportion of the Albanian doctors have been seduced away by Germany because they're short of doctors, particularly rather unpopular jobs in remote rural areas. But as an Albanian doctor working in Germany will earn so much more money than in Albania. Same in Romania. I was lecturing to medical students in Cluj-Napoca. Fantastic students, like the young Ukrainians I meet here, really enthusiastic, speaking good English, hardworking. But they all said, well, actually, we don't really have a future in Romania as doctors. It's all corrupt, and you have to pay the senior doctors to get a job, and we'll all end up working abroad. Right. And we didn't really want to, actually, but it's very complicated.
It is. And Ukraine is part of the global processes here, at least European processes.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, very much so. And that's what
everybody's moving west to higher salaries, to better conditions of labor.
I mean, it's,
Yeah, and where is the way out?
Well, it's complicated. Is the answer. No, well, there are no easy answers. No. And you have to identify a problem and then try to think, well, what are the possible solutions? At the moment, as far as I know, medical migration is not a particular problem in Ukraine. But if for medicine, if students go abroad to study, which is quite difficult actually, you know, it's very tempting for them to stay. And those who have come back often find it very difficult because the contrast is so great between the system here and where they trained in a Western country.
Right. Okay. So it's about also the incompatibility of systems in a way.
Well, yes, and the fact that the medical system here is still pretty corrupt, and both. And the thing about paying doctors bothers me less, because you know it's open to exploitation by doctors, but they are paid so little by the state. The patients and their families know they have to help them. But the business of training, and if you have to pay to get into somebody's department and things like that, that I think is reprehensible.
Yes, yeah, it certainly is. And unfortunately, things are not improving as fast as they should in this area.
Well, I mean, you could argue either way. A war accelerates change or stops it. I don't know. But all I can do is come here and give talks and try to throw a few pebbles on the pile. And because I have many very, very good friends here, and I'm quite well known, I cannot stop coming. You know, I have to. My wife is exaggeratedly terrified when I come here. So I've had to promise not to go to Odessa, where I have many contacts, or obviously to the east, or she'd go mad of anxiety. But she accepts I have to come, because if I stopped coming, I would feel I was betraying a country which I still feel has a great future. I mean, I remember I first started coming to Eastern Europe in 1990. I was in Poland and Warsaw, in Krakow and Warsaw. You know, gosh, they were rough and communist and grey. Look at Poland now. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And, you know, Ukraine could be like that.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to be a bit more contaminated by the Russians. But, I mean, Poland was totally corrupt, run by a corrupt communist regime, secret police and all that, and it's made fantastic progress.
Yeah, it certainly has.
And Ukraine, war apart, has this tremendous wealth of agriculture, and in some areas of high tech and computers and IT is very, very well advanced.
It is, yeah. Well, not everyone in Europe is particularly happy about Ukraine's agriculture.
No, I know. Yeah. Particularly the Poles. But,
right.
You know.
Yeah, but I think these issues can be.
Well, they can be resolved. They can all be resolved.
Absolutely.
Yes, they can all be resolved.
So you are very frank and honest, and when you say something about the Ukraine's healthcare system, you always speak very openly and honestly. So honest people have friends, but also honest people have enemies.
Oh yes, very much so. Shoot the messenger. Yes.
So have you ever had any serious conflict with Ukrainian healthcare authorities?
Directly, no, but some of the people I've worked with have, partly having been sort of egged on by me. No, I've not. And also, the fact I keep on coming here, I make no money from it. I fund it all myself. It's, it gives one a certain credibility. I say, anyway, what I say is common knowledge. All I'm saying is what all my Ukrainian friends tell me.
Exactly. Yes, but it's one thing hearing, all this from a Ukrainian, and it's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
A person with your name and status endorsing this. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah, and that's I guess that's like a real pain for the
as we say,
the authorities.
Change is difficult,
Yes, absolutely.
And doctors are conservative. They can become terribly complacent, because many patients come to harm anyway. it's very easy just to dismiss another bad result and deny. I've seen some terrible mistakes which then get completely brushed under the carpet. Now, granted, England was like that 50 or 60 years ago. Now there's a whole vast machinery for identifying mistakes and duty of candour. We have a legal obligation to confess, if things have gone badly. In practice, of course, it's very difficult to achieve and very difficult to enforce. But, you only can make things better if you acknowledge that there's a problem and then work out how to solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, we've moved to problems and difficulties. Let's speak about something on the brighter side. Let's speak about your books.
Yeah.
So, to think about the reception of your books in the West and in Ukraine, because you met the audience, your readers, both in Western countries and in Ukraine. Have you noticed any difference in the way that the people, the audience, accepted your books and interpreted your books?
No, I never wrote the books, particularly the first book, which was a huge worldwide bestseller, which I didn't particularly expect. I had no reason to expect it. But I'm very proud and still rather surprised that so many young people and medical students really like them. And I think the reason for that is that life is difficult, and if you're a young medical student, or even more so a young doctor, you're often very stressed and anxious. And to hear a very senior person like me, saying the same is actually quite reassuring.
Right.
Because of course, as doctors, we have to affect confidence and certainty with our patients. We have to be honest, but patients don't like frightened or anxious doctors.
They don't.
But we also tend to play this role of confidence and certainty with our juniors and with medical students. And to realize, to have somebody like myself who speaks from sort of behind the mask and says, actually, a lot of the time in my work, I'm very anxious and I've made some very bad mistakes and have many regrets, isn't a way reassuring, because we all make mistakes.
We all do.
The tendency has always been that doctors are either saints or criminals, but they're not. We're human beings with all that means. Yeah. And some are better than others. But
well, I think the reason for the success of your book is that you speak so honestly about it.
Well, that's what everybody says. I'd like to think also, because I write well.
That's what writers want to hear, that they really write well, and you do.
I hope so.
Yes. So, what are you working on now as a writer?
Well, I mean, my last third book, which describes my being diagnosed with advanced cancer, which is at the moment in remission, is called And Finally, because I basically said everything I have to say about myself and about my work as a doctor and my life. So I still do a lot of teaching and lecturing in many different countries, because I have a role both as a doctor, lecturing on neurosurgery, lecturing to medical students, and as a writer, going to literary festivals. The literary festivals ought to fade away now, because my third book came out over a year ago. But I mean, this year, by the end of the year, if things work out, I will have been to Barcelona twice, Mexico twice, Ukraine 2 or 3 times, Albania and Istanbul twice. And it's all work related, and it's not tour. I don't do tourism, and it's all related mainly to medicine and books. I expect, but next year it won't be quite so busy. I get a bit fed up with all this travelling, and it sounds very spoilt to say that. It's obviously a huge privilege to travel around the world like that. But I do it, and this is not me being pious or boasting, I do it actually out of a sense of duty, because I know that what I say is unusual, and the message of the difficulties of being honest, which applies to all walks of life, the enormous importance of true team working, of constructive, critical relationships with your colleagues, which is vital to good medicine, but vital to all human activities.
Absolutely.
Is an important message. And because people have this exaggerated belief that there's something terribly special about brain surgery, it isn't. All this, technically, it's like any other branch of surgery, although a bit different. But what is special about neurosurgery is that it's so horribly dangerous. So the decision-making is incredibly important. And then that all becomes about psychology and self-deception and all sorts of things come into it. And the decision-making is not straightforward.
Yes, absolutely. So you travel,
Yep.
you write, you give lectures, but if any time is left from this busy schedule, what do you do on top of that? What do you like doing?
I love seeing my grandchildren. I was a bad father because I spent the whole time at work and always put work first. I'm very fortunate, I scarcely deserve it, but I have a good relationship with my 3 children, who are all now middle-aged. And I've got 4 grandchildren whom I adore, although I dread the future for them, because I'm very concerned about climate change. Mm-hmm. I'm well versed in climate change, and it's really very scary what's going on. I know in Ukraine people say yes, but, you know.
At the moment, yes,
we've
got other concerns.
But as the great Sir David Attenborough has said, in 100 years' time, the war here will seem like a minor blip compared to what probably will be happening. And even now, every day, massive floods in Brazil, massive floods in Afghanistan, forest wildfires again in British Columbia. I used to think British Columbia and northwest Canada, I've been there, it's beautiful, would be the place to escape. It's not.
It's not.
It's not. The northern hemisphere is heating up more than anything else. But there's nothing you can do about that. We just have to, we have to vote for green parties, not that they will win, but they will hopefully persuade the bigger political parties to adopt a slightly green agenda. But with the thought of Trump maybe winning in November and things like that, it's difficult to be optimistic. Anyway, so I love seeing my grandchildren. My wife lives in Oxford, and I have a home in London still, because I still go into my hospital to teach, but not to treat patients. And my 3 children all live relatively nearby in London. So I divide my time between London and Oxford. I have a small but I think very beautiful garden in London, which I adore, and I keep bees there, which Ukrainians would approve of. I've had 2 beehives on the go for, I think, 16 years now. Everybody says it's the best honey they've ever had. Well, probably being polite, but the thing is that in London is full of gardens, and I'm in Wimbledon, where there are lots of gardens, so my bees have a great time and make very good honey. And I also am a great woodworker. I have a workshop at the end of my garden, so I'm always making things, whether it's tables or things for my family or whatever. I made very, very elaborate dolls' houses for my granddaughters during the pandemic, which each one took about a year to make.
Amazing.
So they're quite complicated. So if you answer, and at the moment I'm not writing anything other than my diary. My books are simply versions of a daily diary I've kept more or less ever since I was 12 years old. I'm trying to decide what to do with this mountain of diaries and hard drives, and I don't quite know what to do about it. And then the BBC has commissioned a 3rd documentary about me. It's not false modesty to say I'm not quite sure why, but that's being sort of partly made at the moment. I said, come out to Ukraine with me. Oh no, we can't do that.
But I mean, how can you make a documentary about Henry Marsh without coming to Ukraine?
Well, I know exactly. So, because it's such an important part of my life. So anyway, I don't know how they'll resolve that question.
Yeah, you are such an important part of Ukraine now.
Well, I am in a way, and of course it puts I'm obviously very proud of that fact, but it puts quite a burden on me in a way, because if you have influence, you must use it, you know. Yeah. And I feel therefore that is why I have to be critical. I say I love the country. I'm only here because I love the country, and more particularly my wonderful friends. And of course that's one of the great strengths of Ukraine, which in many ways we've lost in Western Europe, which is the strength of family and friendship. Because again, if the state is against you, you know, you depend on your immediate social networks. And it's wonderful the way Ukrainians sort things out and help each other, even though, as I was saying earlier, sometimes it drives me mad, the whole last minute thing.
That's the way we are.
But it's remarkable. How you lot managed before mobile phones, I don't know. But they must have been...
Hectic, chaotic.
Yeah, because, I mean, yes, I've never seen mobile phones used quite as intensely as here in Ukraine.
Yeah, we love mobile phones. Yeah. We love to keep in touch and...
Yeah. The strength of family and friendship is wonderful. In fact, in many ways, I have more close friends here in Ukraine than I have back in England. Almost.
Yeah, that speaks millions, yeah.
Sorry?
That speaks a lot. That speaks
No, and if I didn't have so many close friends, I wouldn't keep on coming back.
Yeah, obviously. So, in our podcast, there are some typical questions that we ask to all the guests, and they're not very easy, and maybe they're not like really brilliant questions, but still, like for the sake of consistency.
Yes.
What is one thing that the whole world gets wrong about Ukraine? Still.
Obviously, it's a generalization, but I'd say the fact it's a young country potentially with a great future. A flower struggling to get out of rather grubby soil.
I see. So basically the world does not see that potential yet in Ukraine.
I suspect so, but I mean it's a big, broad question, isn't it?
What about Ukrainians? So what is one thing that we get wrong about ourselves?
How infuriating you can be. Getting Ukrainians, I said, Ukrainians are wonderful at helping each other out, but they're also terrible at not cooperating sometimes, and particularly men, seem to get into endless conflicts rather than cooperate. They really need their heads knocking together sometimes.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And although this is not unique to Ukraine, I find that Ukrainian tendency to waffle and, it's partly because the English tradition is one of trying to speak very precisely with a minimum of flowery phrases and meaningless phrases. I remember years ago, I gave a medical lecture summer in Kiev, and one of my friends who speaks good English said, "Look, Henry, people won't respect you. It was too easy to understand." So I was with another English colleague. He said, "Right." So he gave a completely incomprehensible lecture about epilepsy, and people were very impressed. Some of that perhaps is a Marxist-Leninist educational tradition that completely fucked people's brains. It was meaningless rubbish, pure verbiage.
Right.
And that's a terrible intellectual tradition. Whereas in England we're very lucky to have a rather wonderful literary tradition of clarity and precision.
Exactly, yes. I think a lot of that comes and stems from those writings that were like the holy writing of the Soviet system.
They were just complete crap.
Absolutely, yes.
Terrible.
Yes, and now when people wanted to impress someone, they use the most complicated sentence structures and terminology.
But again, it comes back to the whole Potemkin village business,
Yeah.
It's all a big lie, it's all a big pretense.
So pretending, not being.
Yes, exactly.
So 32 years.
Yes.
That's a lot of time. That's a long time.
I don't know anybody else who's been coming out so regularly for so long. I mean, I'm deeply ashamed of the fact I've only picked up a few words of Ukrainian, but it is quite a difficult language to learn if you speak something like English. And I've never been very good at languages anyway. I'm half German, but I'm the only member of my family who doesn't speak German for various reasons. And if you're going to learn a foreign language when I was younger, you have to use it all the time. And because, in fact, I only come out to Ukraine a few weeks a year,
right.
I'm not going to use it. So it's not worth investing a huge amount of effort and time into learning it.
Yeah. So if to look back at these 32 years, is there like one single Ukraine story that like epitomizes your experience over this time? Something that is very, very, I don't know, illustrative, very telling about all these years of coming to Ukraine, fighting the, these remnants of the Soviet system?
I think it's I can't tell it as a single story, but the quite incredible strength of the voluntary sector in supporting the war effort is quite extraordinary. I mean, yeah, sure, in Britain during the Second World War, people were, taking down their metal fences, and in Germany they were handing over their kitchen pots and pans. But I mean, of course, this reflects the weakness of the state here as well. But it's fantastic, the degree of voluntary effort. I mean, quite remarkable. And that is, I think, one of the, something that's so special about this country. And it was obviously there in a latent form before the war. And as I said earlier, it is the fact that family and social networks are so fantastically strong here.
Yeah.
Quite amazing.
Yes. If you were to write a book about Ukraine, I hope maybe one day you will, but what would be the title?
I'd have to think very hard about that, but it'd be something about a country which is terribly divided and with a terribly complicated history, but with a sort of a mosaic which somehow could form something very beautiful. But I can't think of a single title offhand at the moment.
Okay, but something around the mosaic form.
There's something about the idea of broken and split, but somehow if it can grow into a unified thing of some sort.
That's a beautiful metaphor, and I think
it's a slightly wordy metaphor. But
yeah, but it covers, some very important aspects of Ukraine quite correctly. Okay.
Pleasure. Okay,
Dr. Henry Marsh, thank you so much, and thank you for staying with us till the end. Please subscribe to the channel if you like it, and we've got Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and see you at the next episode. Bye.
Bye.